ransomware, cyber hygiene, and converged endpoint management. We'll cover it all in this latest episode of To The Point. Hello and welcome. I'm Maggie Miller. Joining us today is Scott Crawford of 451 Research, a part of S&P Global Market Intelligence. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Maggie. Good to be here.
So a ransomware attack occurs every 11 seconds on average. Why are organizations still struggling with major vulnerabilities and not prepared for the next Log4j incident?
Well, there's a lot of contributors to that, but one of the most substantial is that organizations really do have to establish, first of all, solid foundations of both visibility into their environment, as well as into the threat landscape and exposure mitigation. So those two aspects, visibility and exposure mitigation, you do have to have some solid foundations laid in order to be able to tackle virtually any emerging security incident of any kind or any emerging type of threat, really. That begins with, first of all, with the very basics. Identify the assets that you can with your environment. Keep up to date to the extent that you can with awareness of security vulnerabilities and exposures. Certainly identify the tools to keep them as well maintained as an organization can. And lastly, establish practices to bring all of those together, to keep those systems well maintained. But there's two things that change constantly that will challenge organizations pretty much all the time, regardless of maturity, regardless of organization size, regardless of industry vertical, and so on. And that's the inventory of assets themselves. Assets, not just in IT, but also beyond IT, operational technologies, for example, may come and go fairly freely. As will newly discovered security vulnerabilities and exposures. The practices for dealing with these may change as the landscape itself changes. And one of the best examples that we have of this right now, well, there's two actually. One of them is managing open source software, and you mentioned Log4j. We saw it in connection with Log4j late last year, as well as bespoke systems and applications that may require an organization to invest in maintaining its own posture, often with its own team, regardless what those applications may be built on. These are things that are in constant flux in the environment. The level of the maturity of the organization will be reflected in their ability to deal with these, but without building solid foundations on which to elaborate, then organizations are really going to have challenges.
So this brings up another good point. Why is it important for organizations to maintain superior IT hygiene as a foundational best practice, and what should this involve?
First of all, without establishing the foundations we mentioned, I noted that the organization has nothing to build on. So they have to start, first of all, from established precedent for dealing with the known before taking on the unknown. Because if they don't, otherwise they can't anticipate the cost, the time required, the resources needed, and gaps in current approach on which to build and on which to improve and grow their maturity. So first of all, have to establish a basis for visibility and remediation of concerns. For many organizations, that means using the tools that are available to them now or investing in tools to which they can naturally extend their existing approach, and for addressing the assets that they know and are aware of. Beyond that, though, once they have those practices in place, they really need to establish practices for discovering new assets and adding those that can be managed to existing tools and processes, as well as identifying those that can't. That's one of the first places where organizations will see gaps that they need to deal with. They need to establish practices for maintaining visibility into the security issues across all those assets. And that may not necessarily be when things like new patches emerge. They will need to be aware of emerging threats as they come out and be prepared to deal with them when remediation does appear if supplied by third parties, vendors, or how they can implement themselves. They need to assess the efficiency of their current approach. For example, how comprehensive is it really? How close to continuous is it? Because if it isn't reasonably close to continuous, then you are going to have gaps in time where you may have issues exposed, which presents opportunities for attackers who can focus on the specific opportunities that will do them the most benefit, as opposed to defenders that have to stretch an investment across the entire attack surface to the extent that they can, which means they have to prioritize. Efficiency is one way to address that, and addressing how the gaps exist and how they can be addressed to be more efficient is one way to help close them. So in assuring progress towards more complete coverage, beyond that, organizations really need to consider environments that can't be addressed by existing approaches in either tools or practice. Multiple system vendors, for example. It's common to assume that we have one predominant vendor for most of our IT, but that isn't necessarily always the case. Open source software may not appear just in the form of bespoke packages that are used to develop bespoke applications. They may appear in IT assets themselves as an alternative to commonly deployed system vendors. This aspect of bespoke and applications is an emerging area for things like DevOps, but we do see progress being made. But you look even further in terms of what about non-IT environments? Specialized techniques and knowledge may be required for operational technologies, for example. Processes must be specific to those environments, like windows of critical availability, to cite another example. So starting from the known, growing towards either the unknown or where the organization needs to grow to close its gaps, doing these in sequence and establishing those foundations accordingly in these areas will help organizations continue to mature.
And what are the advantages of a converged endpoint management strategy over point solutions?
Well, the first of all is, this concept of a single point of reference and control. In other words, the idea of implementing once and using many across many use cases, across many environments. This is a really good way to address the issue because it improves efficiency when it's sufficiently comprehensive. It improves reliability when processes can be implemented consistently. So centralized implementations of processes that are common to all environments can help improve the effectiveness of the program through bringing greater order, frankly, to the program. But in order to realize these benefits, tools do have to be sufficiently comprehensive, which means that processes must integrate both visibility and response. And they must be able to embrace a diverse asset inventory that's subject to constant change. They must be able to embrace a variety of techniques depending on the provider of the endpoint technology, or no provider in the case of fully self-maintained open source or bespoke development. And most importantly, they must be able to scale, even for a small organization. Organizations may be amazed at just not only how many assets they have, but how quickly they come and go, how diverse they are, how quickly the threat landscape changes for those assets. So the ability to scale, not just in numbers of assets, but in terms of time and efficiency and speed and effectiveness of response. Tools have to be sufficiently responsive to get organizational strategies as close to continuous and comprehensive as possible.
Finally, what is one key takeaway about where the market is going and why collaboration matters to organizations today?
Well, as we noted earlier, IT is constantly changing, and it's not just IT anymore. So first of all, again, without establishing these solid foundations where they can, organizations may in fact already be behind. They may be caught flat-footed by the next major exposure crisis. The number of organizations that really had to scramble to deal with a highly visible issue such as Log4j spoke to not only the diversity of the environment, but just how effective our processes in areas like open source and bespoke development. So without having a foundation to build on to expedite response to emerging issues like that, organizations are really going to be at a disadvantage. So investing today to prepare best for what may emerge tomorrow is probably my key takeaway from what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I really like that. And thank you so much for your insights today, Scott. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Maggie. It's always a pleasure to speak with you as well.
And thank you all for watching. I'm Maggie Miller, and this is To The Point.